In the middle of Europe's darkest centuries, when waves of plague swept through towns and villages, a strange figure walked the streets, dressed in a long cloak, carrying a wooden cane, and with a mask shaped like the beak of a great bird. This figure became one of the most haunting images of the medieval world, the plague doctor. Who were these doctors? Why did they dress in such unsettling costumes? And what purpose did those bird-like masks truly serve? Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we will move slowly through this story, the fears that shaped medicine, the garments designed for protection, and the lives of the men who wore them. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can join again for more calm journeys into the strange details of history. Before the strange bird-like masks of plague doctors appeared on the streets, before their canes tapped against cobblestones, Europe was already shaped by fear. The plague, often called the Black Death in later centuries, was not simply an illness. It was an event that reshaped societies, emptied villages, silenced towns, and filled chronicles with despair. To understand why doctors dressed in such unusual ways, we must first understand the world into which they stepped. A world where plague seemed unstoppable, mysterious, and merciless. The first great outbreak of plague struck Europe in the mid-14th century, sweeping from the east across Mediterranean ports and inland to nearly every corner of the continent. It killed in staggering numbers. Contemporary reports describe entire families perishing within days, whole streets left empty, villages abandoned. Modern historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population may have died within just a few years. Such numbers are hard to grasp, but for those living through it, the evidence was everywhere. Funerals without end, bells tolling constantly, carts carrying the dead to hastily dug pits. Cities were particularly vulnerable, crowded, unsanitary, and reliant on trade. They became the perfect breeding ground for disease. Merchants brought goods from far away, but they also carried the plague. Ships docking at Mediterranean ports often carried rats, whose fleas transmitted the illness. Once in a city, it spread rapidly from house to house, leaving no class untouched. Nobles and peasants alike succumbed. Wealth provided little protection, though it sometimes allowed flight to the countryside, if escape came soon enough. For ordinary people, the cause of plague was unclear. Medicine in medieval Europe was based on humoral theory, the idea that health depended on the balance of four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Imbalances caused illness, and treatments aimed to restore equilibrium through bleeding, purging, or diet. While physicians debated these theories, the sudden, devastating force of plague seemed beyond explanation. Some thought it spread through bad air or miasma, rising from swamps, waste, or even the breath of the sick. Others believed it was punishment from the heavens, a scourge for human sins. These beliefs shaped daily behavior. People burned herbs to cleanse the air, carried flowers or spices to ward off corruption, and lit large fires in public squares hoping to purify the atmosphere. Processions of penitents marched through towns, whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing divine wrath. Families sealed themselves indoors, nailing shutters closed. Others fled cities entirely, abandoning homes in desperate attempts to outrun the invisible threat. None of these measures worked consistently, yet they gave structure to fear, something to do when helplessness seemed overwhelming. The symptoms of plague terrified witnesses. Accounts describe swellings, buboes, in the groin, armpit, or neck, blackened skin from internal bleeding, fever, delirium, and sudden death. Victims often died within days of first showing signs, leaving families stunned by the speed of loss. Priests recorded that confession and burial could barely keep pace. Chroniclers wrote of priests and monks dying in such numbers that churches and monasteries fell silent. The psychological impact was immense. When every cough or fever might mean death, the entire fabric of daily life frayed. This was the environment in which medical practitioners operated. Some were university-trained physicians, schooled in Galenic theory, familiar with classical texts. Others were barber surgeons, apothecaries, or local healers, their knowledge practical rather than theoretical. All faced the same enemy, a disease they could neither fully understand nor effectively cure. Their role, then, was often less about healing and more about bearing witness, offering what comfort they could, and attempting to protect themselves from infection. Fear of contagion shaped how doctors behaved. Unlike many illnesses, plague seemed to leap from person to person, striking those who cared for the sick. Doctors saw colleagues fall ill after visiting patients, priests die after hearing confessions, neighbors perish after tending to friends. The danger was clear, even if the mechanism was not. It was in this context that protective clothing began to emerge, not at first the bird-like masks we now recognize, but simple measures: cloths soaked in vinegar, gloves to avoid direct contact, long robes to cover exposed skin. The social role of plague doctors was complex. Some were hired by towns, paid a salary to tend to the sick and record the dead. Others offered private services to wealthy families. A few volunteered, driven by duty or faith. Many were outsiders, brought in from distant towns when local physicians had died or fled. Their presence in a city was both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because someone remained to face the disease. Unsettling because their very arrival signaled how serious the crisis had become in the collective imagination of medieval Europe. Plague doctors became symbols of resilience against horror. Yet at this stage, their appearance was not yet standardized. Some wore ordinary robes, others improvised coverings. The bird-like mask, with its long beak stuffed with aromatic herbs, would appear later, in the 17th century, when plague returned in waves. But its roots lay in this earlier world, where people believed that corrupt air carried disease and that strong scents could guard against it. The psychological atmosphere of plague-ridden Europe cannot be overstated. Bells tolled constantly for funerals. Processions of carts carried the dead. Silence fell on once busy markets. Survivors spoke of cities half empty, of doors nailed shut with families inside, of fields untended and livestock wandering ownerless. Such scenes seared themselves into memory, ensuring that any figure who stood against the plague, however oddly dressed, would be remembered with awe and unease. We must also consider how chroniclers shaped our view. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio in Italy, or later European historians, emphasized the terror and scale of loss. Their accounts dwell on the strangeness of society during plague: servants abandoning masters, parents leaving children, priests unable to keep up with burials. These narratives, while colored by horror, reflect a real truth. The plague was not only a medical crisis, but a social one, dissolving the bonds of community. Thus, before the bird-like masks, before the long cloaks and canes, there was simply fear. Doctors, healers, priests, and families all faced a disease that defied understanding. The world of plague in medieval Europe was one of constant uncertainty, where explanations shifted, remedies failed, and the only certainty was loss. It was within this crucible of fear and desperation that the plague doctor's costume would later emerge, a visible attempt to fight invisible death. To understand why medieval doctors wore those haunting masks, we must first hold in our minds this world of fire and silence, the tolling bells, the sealed houses, the crowds fleeing cities, the healers struggling to stay alive. Only then can we see the mask not as curiosity or costume, but as part of a broader struggle, the human attempt to find safety, order, and meaning in the midst of catastrophe. Long before the iconic bird-like masks appeared, physicians and healers in plague-stricken Europe were already experimenting with ways to shield themselves from the dangers of disease. These early attempts were born not from scientific certainty, but from fear, tradition, and the medical theories available at the time. Each layer of clothing, each ritual, each practice represented a fragment of hope, a fragile barrier between life and the invisible threat that stalked the streets. When plague erupted in the 14th century, doctors quickly realized that their work placed them among the most vulnerable. They saw how priests collapsed after hearing confessions of the sick, how neighbors fell ill after nursing loved ones, how servants died after tending to masters. Patterns were clear, even if causes were not. To be near the plague was to risk death. And so, doctors sought protection. At first, these protections were simple. Many physicians carried with them cloths soaked in vinegar or wine, pressing them against their noses and mouths. The sharp scent was thought to cleanse the air, neutralizing the miasma, the bad air believed to spread disease. Some sprinkled themselves with rose water or burned aromatic herbs before entering a patient's house. These measures gave little real protection, but in an age when air itself seemed dangerous, such rituals offered both comfort and courage. Clothing, too, was adapted. Doctors began to wear long robes, often made of heavy fabric such as linen or wool. These robes covered most of the body, preventing direct contact with the sick. Gloves, usually of leather, shielded the hands. Some wore boots that reached to the knee, further reducing exposure. Hoods or caps covered the hair, while veils or scarves wrapped the face. Though lacking the dramatic appearance of later plague costumes, these early outfits already reflected a clear principle: cover the body fully. Leave as little skin exposed as possible. The materials chosen often reflected both practicality and symbolism. Linen was valued for its smoothness and supposed purity, believed to resist corruption. Leather was tough and easier to clean, so gloves and boots were often fashioned from it. Some physicians coated their garments in wax, hoping that this layer would repel disease. Others carried amulets or charms sewn into their robes, mixing spiritual protection with physical. In every case, the aim was the same: to stand between the self and the unseen danger. Perfumes and fumigation played a constant role. Doctors burned juniper, rosemary, or frankincense in sick rooms, surrounding themselves with smoke. They carried pomanders, small containers filled with spices, herbs, or resin that could be held to the nose. Some even wore these on chains around the neck, letting the strong scents act as shields against corrupted air. The logic was consistent with humoral theory. If disease entered through breath, then purifying breath with pleasant aromas might preserve health. The cane or staff, later a defining feature of the plague doctor's image, also had early origins. Physicians began to carry wooden sticks not only as symbols of authority, but as practical tools. With them, they could examine patients without touching directly, lift clothing to observe buboes, or point to afflicted areas. The staff kept a distance, small but meaningful. It was also used to gesture in crowds, to maintain space, or even to push aside those who pressed too close. In times of panic, when fear of contagion ran high, the cane became both a barrier and a statement. The doctor was to be obeyed, for he risked himself among the dying. That we must imagine these early plague doctors as somber figures, wrapped in long dark robes, their faces veiled, their hands gloved, their scent of herbs and vinegar announcing their approach. To citizens, their appearance was both reassuring and frightening. Reassuring because it meant someone remained to tend to the sick. Frightening because their very presence signaled plague nearby. In Chronicles, one sometimes reads of doctors treated with awe, suspicion, or even hostility. In desperate times, any figure associated with the plague could draw mixed feelings. Despite these measures, survival rates among doctors were grim. Many fell ill despite their precautions, dying alongside patients. Yet their attempts at protection reveal something profound: the human need to act, to prepare, to create barriers against the unknown. Even if those barriers were symbolic, they gave strength to step into houses where others dared not go. Protection, however imperfect, made the unbearable task possible. The city authorities recognized the value of these doctors. Town councils hired them, providing salaries, housing, and sometimes even special clothing. A plague doctor contract from Italian cities in the 15th century often included clauses about protective gear, long coats, gloves, boots, and sometimes masks or visors. Though each city varied, the idea was consistent. Officials wanted to ensure that physicians had every possible chance of survival, for their work was essential in recording deaths, advising on burials, and offering what treatments they could. It is in these early attempts that we see the foundation of the later, more elaborate costume. The bird-like mask, with its long beak stuffed with herbs, was simply a more dramatic extension of earlier practices with vinegar cloths and pomanders. The long waxed cloak was a refinement of earlier robes. The leather gloves, boots, and cane remained, but combined into a standardized uniform. In this way, the famous plague doctor's garb was less an invention out of nothing and more the culmination of generations of trial, error, and fear. The world of early protective measures was not only about clothing. Behavior, too, was adapted. Doctors learned to stand at a distance, to avoid sitting or lingering in sick rooms. They kept windows open to allow air to flow, believing that stagnant air bred disease. They advised families to burn bedding, to clean houses with vinegar, to bury possessions thought contaminated. Many of these practices, though based on incorrect theories, had the unintended effect of reducing risk, airing rooms, limiting contact, destroying infected materials. Archaeological traces of these early protections are scarce, but written contracts, city ordinances, and medical treatises survive. They describe garments, lists of herbs, recipes for scented mixtures, and rules for plague doctors' conduct. From these we reconstruct the image, a figure robed and gloved, carrying vinegar cloths, surrounded by smoke, holding a staff, stepping cautiously into the presence of death. The sight of such a doctor in the streets must have left a deep impression. For survivors, these figures were part of the landscape of plague, as much as funeral carts, tolling bells, and shuttered houses. In art and literature, they became symbols, sometimes of bravery, sometimes of futility, often of the strange and uncanny. The bird-like mask would later fix the image forever, but even without it, the early plague doctor already seemed more apparition than man. Thus, the story of early protection is not one of success, but of effort. Doctors died, yet their measures gave shape to the struggle. They remind us that even in the darkest times, people sought ways to resist, however imperfectly. The vinegar cloth, the waxed cloak, the burning herbs, all were small acts of defiance against forces that seemed unstoppable. In them we see the beginnings of medical protective gear, born not of science, but of necessity, fear, and hope. The haunting image of the plague doctor in his bird-like mask did not emerge suddenly in the first waves of the Black Death in the 14th century. Rather, it was the result of centuries of fear, experimentation, and gradual refinement of protective clothing. By the 17th century, especially during outbreaks in Italy and France, the plague doctor's costume had become standardized: a long, waxed cloak, leather gloves, boots, a wide-brimmed hat, a wooden cane, and most striking of all, the mask with its curved beak. To understand how and why this uniform came into being, we must trace the path from improvised coverings to a costume that has endured in memory as one of history's most unsettling symbols. The idea of protective clothing for physicians had already existed in medieval Europe. As we saw earlier, doctors covered themselves in long robes, gloves, and veils, hoping to block the miasma, or corrupted air, thought to carry disease. They carried pomanders filled with herbs, pressed vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces, and fumigated rooms with smoke. These early methods shaped the logic of the later costume. Disease was airborne, scent could repel it, and the body must be fully shielded. The shift to the bird-like mask is most often associated with the physician Charles Delorme, who served the French court in the early 17th century. Around 1619, Delorme described an outfit designed specifically for plague doctors. His costume included a waxed canvas or leather overcoat, breeches attached to boots, a shirt tucked into trousers, and gloves, all sealed to prevent exposure. Over this, a wide-brimmed hat signified the medical profession. But the most distinctive feature was the mask, fitted with glass openings for the eyes and a long, hollow beak, curved downward like that of a bird. Inside the beak, aromatic herbs, spices, or vinegar-soaked cloths were stuffed, creating a barrier of scent against the supposed poison of the air. The mask's design made sense within the framework of humoral and miasmatic theory. If plague spread through invisible vapors, then filtering inhaled air through strong perfumes might neutralize the danger. The beak allowed enough space to hold mixtures of herbs, juniper, cloves, myrrh, mint, camphor, or dried roses, thought to strengthen the breath. Vinegar sponges were sometimes added, their acidity believed to purify air. In a way, the mask functioned as the earliest form of a respirator, though based on flawed medical theory. The costume's long waxed coat also had practical reasoning. Coated in wax or oil, it was thought to repel contagion carried by droplets or contact. In reality, it may have had some effect in preventing fleas, which carried plague bacteria, from clinging easily to fabric. The leather gloves and boots further ensured no skin touched patients directly. The cane, often depicted in engravings, served multiple purposes. Doctors used it to examine buboes without touching, to lift clothing, to maintain distance in crowds, or to gesture while avoiding contact. When such figures walked the streets, they inspired awe and fear. To the common people, the plague doctor appeared almost otherworldly, a tall silhouette in dark robes, with a bird's head and glowing eyes of glass. Children whispered of them as spirits of death. Adults shuddered at their approach. Yet at the same time, their presence brought reassurance that someone remained to face the plague, to record deaths, to offer what care was possible. The costume was as much psychological armor as physical. For the doctor, it created a sense of separation, a protective shell against both contagion and the despair of confronting endless death that we must note. However, that the plague doctor's uniform was not universal. Many towns and cities could not afford such elaborate costumes for their hired physicians. Some doctors continued to wear simpler robes and masks, or even none at all, relying only on vinegar cloths. The bird mask became most iconic in southern Europe, especially Italy and France, where engravings and written descriptions fixed its image. In northern Europe, plague doctors often looked less dramatic. Yet over time, the beaked mask became the enduring symbol across all of Europe, preserved in art and memory even where it had been rare in practice. The effectiveness of the costume was limited. The herbs and perfumes did not block bacteria. The glass eyepieces sometimes fogged. The beak restricted vision. Yet unintentionally, some parts of the design offered real protection. The full covering reduced contact with fleas, the true carriers of plague, though no one understood this at the time. The cane allowed doctors to avoid direct touch, reducing risk of exposure. And the psychological benefit, to both doctor and patient, was real. In a world where terror itself was contagious, the mask gave the impression of action, of defense, of control. The birth of the plague doctor's costume also reflects a broader cultural shift. By the 17th century, Europe was moving toward more systematic approaches to medicine and public health. Towns employed plague doctors officially, contracts outlined their duties, and uniforms signified their role. Clothing became not just protection but identity. The mask marked a man as one who entered danger for the sake of the community. Even if he could not cure, he could count, witness, and comfort. The costume became the visible sign of civic response to crisis. Artists of the time helped cement this image. Engravings circulated showing plague doctors in their masks, canes in hand, walking amid victims. Pamphlets described their outfits in detail, sometimes mocking them, sometimes praising their bravery. Satirical songs joked about their appearance, yet beneath the humor lay recognition of their grim work. The mask became both a practical tool and a cultural symbol, bridging the gap between medicine, fear, and memory. When we picture the plague doctor today, we see the culmination of centuries of fear distilled into costume. The long beak stuffed with herbs, the waxed cloak, the glass-eyed mask, all were answers to questions no one yet had the science to solve. They tell us less about medicine as we know it, and more about how humans respond to overwhelming terror by creating ritual, by building barriers, by shaping fear into something tangible. Thus, the birth of the plague doctor costume was not an isolated invention, but the result of layers of tradition, theory, and necessity. From vinegar cloths and pomanders grew the long beak. From robes and gloves grew the waxed cloak. From walking sticks grew the cane of authority. Piece by piece, fear clothed itself in leather, linen, and herbs, until it became the figure we now recognize. Half human, half bird, all symbol of plague. The most striking feature of the plague doctor's costume, the long, curved beak, has fascinated generations. It transformed the physician into something bird-like, uncanny, and almost otherworldly. Why a beak? Why this strange design, so different from anything else in medieval clothing? To answer, we must look at the beliefs, fears, and cultural imagination of plague-stricken Europe. The beak was not chosen at random. It carried symbolic, practical, and psychological meanings that reached far beyond its physical form. The immediate, practical explanation was rooted in medical theory. As we have seen, many believed plague spread through miasma or poisoned air. If air carried disease, then it had to be filtered, cleansed, or changed before being breathed. The beak created a space large enough to hold herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloths. Its length allowed air to pass over these aromatic materials before reaching the lungs. In theory, the longer the air traveled, the more thoroughly it was purified. Thus, the beak became a portable fumigator, a miniature garden of scents worn on the face. But the beak also carried symbolic weight. In medieval and early modern thought, birds were often associated with omens, with messages between the human and the divine. Ravens and crows, for instance, were seen as harbingers of death, hovering near battlefields and plague pits. Storks and cranes symbolized vigilance and endurance. To wear a bird's visage was, consciously or not, to step into this world of symbols. The doctor, masked with a beak, became both protector and portent, a figure who walked between life and death, feared and respected at once. The shape itself was unsettling. Curved downward, it resembled the bills of scavenger birds that fed on carrion. To plague-stricken citizens, the sight of such a figure approaching may have reminded them of the death that surrounded them. Yet at the same time, the mask's strangeness created distance. The doctor was no longer simply a man vulnerable to infection. He became something else, encased in ritual, hidden behind a bird's face. This transformation served psychological purposes. For the doctor, the mask created a sense of armor. For the patient, it marked the doctor as a professional, distinct from ordinary neighbors. The herbs inside the beak carried their own meanings. Recipes varied, but common ingredients included rosemary, juniper berries, cloves, myrrh, mint, and camphor. Each of these had associations with healing, purification, or strength. Rosemary was thought to cleanse the air, juniper to repel corruption, cloves and myrrh to fortify the body. Together, they created not only a physical filter but a symbolic shield, a blend of nature's strongest defenses packed into the hollow of the mask. Breathing through them, the doctor partook of both medicine and ritual. The beak also altered the doctor's voice. Speech came muffled, distorted by the hollow chamber. To those listening, his words might have sounded distant or strange, as if carried from another realm. This effect only heightened the doctor's aura as a liminal figure, part healer, part omen. In art and literature, this distortion added to the eeriness of the costume. The bird mask was not simply a barrier against disease. It was also a transformation of identity that we must also remember the role of fear in shaping symbolism. The plague was invisible, incomprehensible, and unstoppable. To fight it, people sought visible rituals. The mask, with its exaggerated beak, became such a ritual. It showed that the doctor had prepared, had armed himself with knowledge and herbs, had taken on the role of protector. The sheer strangeness of the beak may have comforted some, convincing them that special measures were being taken. In a world where confidence could mean survival of the spirit, if not the body, this mattered. The association between birds and disease was not purely symbolic. People observed that carrion birds often gathered where death was present: battlefields, plague pits, abandoned towns. Their presence became intertwined with the idea of pestilence itself. By giving doctors a bird's visage, society may have unconsciously acknowledged this link. The doctor became a human counterpart to the raven or crow, one who appeared wherever plague struck, feeding not on flesh but on knowledge, tasked with managing the dead and the dying. Some historians suggest the beak was also a form of social signaling. Its exaggerated length made plague doctors instantly recognizable from afar. In crowded streets, where panic often reigned, citizens could see the bird-headed figure and know. Here was the physician, the one appointed by the city to tend to the sick. The beak, therefore, was not only a filter but also a badge of office, a uniform as visible as a soldier's armor or a priest's vestments. In visual culture, the beak took on a life of its own. Engravings from the 17th century depict plague doctors with long masks, their canes outstretched as they walked among victims. These images, circulated in pamphlets and prints, spread the beak across Europe, fixing it in the collective imagination. Satirical poems and songs joked about the appearance, but the humor was laced with unease. To laugh at the beak was to cope with the horror it represented. The symbolism of the beak did not fade when the plague receded. Instead, it grew in cultural memory. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the bird-masked doctor had become an emblem of past terror, reproduced in plays, masquerades, and carnival costumes. What had once been functional attire turned into symbol, and what had once terrified became theatrical. Yet the weight of its meaning remained. Even in parody, the beak whispered of death, disease, and the fragility of life. Thus, the beak of the plague doctor was never only about herbs or air. It was about fear made visible, about turning invisible contagion into a battle of symbols. It was a way to armor the spirit as much as the body. It transformed the physician into a figure both feared and trusted, both human and bird, both healer and omen. In its strange curve, we see the attempt of medieval and early modern Europe to give shape to the shapeless, to confront death with ritual, and to walk through plague not as ordinary men, but as figures clothed in myth. When we picture the plague doctor, our eyes are drawn first to the bird-like mask, with its glassy eyes and long beak stuffed with herbs. Yet this costume was not complete without its tools. These objects, staffs, jars, herbs, and notebooks, were extensions of the plague doctor's role, blending practical use, symbolic meaning, and social authority. To walk into a plague-stricken city was to step into a world of silence broken by the sound of coughing, the toll of funeral bells, and the measured tap of a doctor's cane. Each tool told a story about how people tried to confront death when medicine had few answers. The most iconic tool was the cane or staff, often depicted in engravings from the 17th century. This wooden rod served several purposes. It allowed doctors to examine patients without touching them directly. A swollen bubo could be prodded or pointed at from a safe distance. The cane could also be used to lift clothing, to nudge aside bedding, or to signal attendance. In crowded streets, where panic reigned, the staff became a marker of authority. With it, doctors gestured to clear a path, to separate the sick from the healthy, to control the movement of desperate crowds. Some sources suggest it might have been used defensively as well, for fear often bred hostility. And plague doctors were not always welcomed. Alongside the cane, plague doctors carried containers of aromatic substances. Pomanders, small metal or wooden spheres with perforations, were filled with herbs, spices, or resin. These could be held to the nose or hung from a chain around the neck. Their scent was believed to purify the air and fortify the body. Larger jars of vinegar were also common. Cloths soaked in vinegar could be pressed to the face, used to wipe hands, or sprinkled in sick rooms. Recipes for these mixtures survive in medical treatises, often listing rosemary, juniper berries, cloves, myrrh, mint, and camphor. Each was thought to repel corruption or strengthen the body's defenses. Another tool was the ledger or notebook. Many plague doctors were employed by city authorities, tasked not only with treating the sick, but also with recording deaths. Their notebooks contained lists of names, ages, symptoms, and outcomes. These records, though often grim, were vital for understanding the scale of outbreaks. They also served legal purposes, documenting wills, inheritances, and contracts made on the brink of death. In this sense, the plague doctor was part physician, part clerk, part witness to the unraveling of society. His quill and parchment were as essential as his herbs and cane. Bloodletting instruments were also part of the toolkit. Based on humoral theory, many doctors attempted to balance the body by removing excess blood. Lancets, small knives, or leeches were used for this purpose. Though ineffective against plague, these tools reflected the medical logic of the age. Patients expected treatment, and doctors provided what knowledge allowed. The sight of a plague doctor preparing a lancet may have offered the illusion of action. Even if the outcome was unchanged, protective tools extended beyond the mask. Some doctors carried portable braziers, small containers in which herbs were burned to produce constant smoke. They walked through streets trailing clouds of fragrant vapor, surrounding themselves with a moving barrier against miasma. Others carried sachets of dried flowers sewn into their garments, ensuring that every breath and movement was accompanied by scent. These tools were both practical, in the sense of aligning with contemporary theory, and symbolic, marking the doctor as a man who entered danger armed with nature's strongest defenses. The tools also had psychological value. For patients, seeing the cane, the pomander, or the brazier created the impression that measures were being taken, that the doctor had knowledge and preparation. In a world of helplessness, tools gave form to hope. For the doctor himself, they provided ritual. Each action, lifting the cane, sniffing the pomander, burning herbs, was a way to structure the encounter with death, to make it manageable. The tools were, in a sense, extensions of courage that we must also consider how these tools shaped the doctor's identity. Unlike ordinary healers, the plague doctor was marked by uniform and equipment. His tools set him apart, gave him authority, and signaled his role as an official servant of the city. The cane was not only practical but ceremonial, like the scepter of a magistrate. The notebook was not only a record but a symbol of civic responsibility. Even the mask, with its beak of herbs, was both filter and emblem. In this way, the tools of the plague doctor functioned as a language of symbols, speaking to both fear and order. Archaeological traces of these tools are rare, as wood, cloth, and herbs do not survive well over centuries. Yet written descriptions, contracts, and engravings provide rich detail. City records list payments for vinegar, herbs, and gloves supplied to plague doctors. Illustrations show them holding canes, wearing pomanders, or writing in books. Satirical poems describe them as herb-stuffed birds with sticks and ink. These sources, though varied, allow us to reconstruct the toolkit not only of objects, but of meanings. The daily use of these tools reveals much about the rhythm of plague work. A doctor entered a house, holding his pomander to his nose. He tapped his cane on the ground to test stability, lifted a patient's blanket without touching, examined swellings, perhaps lanced a bubo, then recorded observations in his ledger. He sprinkled vinegar on surfaces, instructed attendants to burn bedding, and left with his cane tapping once more. Each tool had its moment, and together they formed a choreography repeated in house after house, street after street, until the city itself seemed to echo with the ritual. The tools were not always welcomed. To some, the cane was a symbol of intrusion, the notebook a sign of bureaucracy, the mask a reminder of death. Families sometimes resisted, fearing that doctors brought contagion rather than prevented it. Satirical songs mocked their bird-like appearance and their reliance on herbs. Yet even mockery confirmed their presence. The tools of the plague doctor had become part of the cultural fabric of plague life, woven into memory and imagination. Over time, the symbolic power of these tools outlived their practical use. Long after the plague receded, the bird mask and cane appeared in carnival costumes, plays, and artworks. The tools became emblems of the past, reminders of a world where death walked openly in the streets and men armed themselves with herbs, vinegar, and ink to confront it. Even today, the image of the plague doctor survives not in medical manuals, but in art, literature, and popular culture, his tools still clutched in memory's grasp. Thus, the tools of the plague doctor were never merely instruments. They were extensions of fear, symbols of authority, and rituals of courage. The cane tapped against cobblestones like the ticking of time. The pomander perfumed the air of death. The notebook captured names before they vanished. In their hands, the plague doctor carried not only wood and leather, but the fragile hope of a society facing its darkest hours. To imagine the daily life of a plague doctor is to step into a world heavy with silence, smoke, and fear. The figure we so often see in engravings, the long beak, the waxed cloak, the cane, was not merely a costume, but a uniform worn into one of history's most relentless workplaces. These men, hired by towns and cities across Europe, had duties that extended far beyond treating illness. They were healers, clerks, witnesses, and sometimes unwilling symbols of hope. To understand their lives, we must move slowly through their routines, their challenges, and the toll their work demanded. The day of a plague doctor began early, often with preparation of the body and the tools. Dressing in layers of linen, wool, or leather, sealing seams with wax, pulling on gloves and boots, fitting the wide-brimmed hat, and finally fastening the bird-like mask. It was a ritual in itself. Each piece of clothing represented both protection and duty. To don the costume was to leave the ordinary world behind and step into the realm of pestilence. Many must have felt the weight of the mask not only on their faces but on their spirits. Their first tasks were often administrative. City authorities who hired plague doctors expected them to record deaths and illnesses. Each morning, the doctor might open his ledger and note the names of those who had died overnight, sometimes walking with assistants through camps or houses to confirm. This role as registrar gave the doctor civic importance. He was a keeper of memory, ensuring that even in chaos, the dead were counted, their existence acknowledged. After this came the visits. Moving slowly through narrow alleys, cane tapping against stones, the doctor entered homes marked by illness. Inside, The air was thick with the smell of sickness, smoke, and fear. Families crowded around beds, desperate for help. Patients lay with swollen buboes, fevered eyes, and trembling breaths. The doctor, protected by his waxed garments and perfumed mask, approached cautiously. He might prod a swelling with his cane, examine the pulse, or speak in a muffled voice through the beak. Treatments varied, lancing buboes, applying poultices, prescribing diets, or attempting bloodletting. Though rarely effective, these acts gave families the sense that something was being done. The emotional burden of this work was immense. The doctor knew his remedies seldom cured, that death was often inevitable. Yet he was bound by contract and conscience to continue. Some saw themselves as servants of knowledge, gathering observations for future physicians. Others saw themselves as servants of God, offering comfort as much as cure. Many must have wrestled with despair, watching entire households vanish despite their efforts. Between visits, plague doctors performed public health duties. They advised councils on quarantine measures, supervised the burning of contaminated bedding, and inspected markets for cleanliness. Some helped organize mass burials, recording the names of the dead as carts carried bodies to pits outside the city walls. In this way, they became both caretakers of the living and overseers of the dead. Socially, their position was ambiguous. On one hand, they were respected as professionals appointed by the city. On the other, they were feared as constant reminders of disease. Their bird-like masks, already uncanny, made them objects of suspicion. Children hid from them, adults sometimes mocked them, and in times of panic they could even face hostility. Yet their presence was unavoidable in every outbreak. The plague doctor was part of the landscape. As familiar as funeral bells and shuttered houses, their contracts reveal both their importance and the risks they faced. Many plague doctors were outsiders, hired from other towns to avoid conflict of interest and because local physicians had fled. Contracts often promised them salaries, lodging, and food, but also restrictions. They were not to treat healthy citizens, not to leave the city, and not to demand extra payment from the poor. These clauses reflect both civic need and mistrust. The plague doctor was valuable but also dangerous, always associated with contagion. Daily survival was uncertain. Despite the costume, many plague doctors fell ill themselves. The herbs in their beaks could not block the bacteria carried by fleas, nor could waxed cloaks always prevent exposure. Some died quickly, their names lost among the lists they themselves had written. Others survived and moved from town to town, building reputations as specialists in pestilence. In either case, their lives were shaped by cycles of outbreak, work, and peril. The personal lives of plague doctors remained shadowy. Few left detailed accounts, for their work was often temporary, bound to the duration of an epidemic. Some were young physicians seeking experience, others older men drawn by the promise of steady pay. Many never returned home. For those who did, the memories must have lingered. The endless funerals, the muffled sound of their own voices in the mask, the tap of the cane on silent streets. Yet there were moments of humanity. Chroniclers speak of plague doctors who comforted children, who stayed with the dying when families fled, who risked themselves to save the sick. Their reputation may have been mixed, but their presence often meant that someone, at least, remained when others had gone. The mask and robe may have made them look inhuman, but beneath it were men struggling with the same fears as those they served. The rhythm of their days ended as it began, with ritual. At night, doctors shed their protective clothing carefully, washing themselves with vinegar or smoke. They cleaned their canes, refreshed the herbs in their masks, and set their ledgers aside. Then they rested, often in lodgings near the camps of the sick, knowing that morning would bring more deaths to record, more houses to enter, more faces to meet through the glass eyes of the mask. The life of a plague doctor was not glamorous. It was a mixture of duty and danger, science and superstition, courage and despair. Their work did not end the plague, but it gave structure to chaos. They were witnesses, chroniclers, and symbols of endurance. In their routines, we see the human attempt to impose order on disaster, to face death with ritual, and to find meaning in service. Thus, the life and work of the plague doctor remind us that history is not only about emperors or kings, but also about those who walked the darkest streets, ledger and cane in hand, carrying both the scent of herbs and the weight of fear. They were men who lived behind masks, whose daily labor preserved fragments of society, and whose memory lingers as one of the most haunting figures of the medieval and early modern world. The plague doctor, with his bird-like mask, long waxed cloak, and cane, walked the streets of Europe as both a medical figure and a cultural symbol. To us today, he seems strange, even theatrical. But to the people who lived through outbreaks of plague, his presence was immediate and personal. How did they see him? Did they welcome him as a savior, fear him as a harbinger of death, or mock him as a strange, ineffectual figure? The answer, like much of history, lies in the complexity of human responses to fear, hope, and uncertainty. For many citizens, the first sight of a plague doctor inspired dread. His very appearance signaled that plague had arrived. Towns rarely employed such specialists unless the situation was dire. When the bird-masked figure entered a neighborhood, people understood that the disease was close at hand. Mothers gathered children indoors, shopkeepers closed stalls, neighbors whispered. The doctor was not simply a healer. He was a walking omen. The long beak, the muffled voice, the gloved hands, all transformed him into something uncanny, half human and half specter at the same time. There was reassurance. The doctor represented authority, order, and the city's attempt to confront disaster. In an age when officials often fled at the first sign of plague, the hired physician remained. He went where others would not, entering houses of the sick, recording deaths, offering what remedies were known. For families desperate for help, his presence was a lifeline. Even if cures were few, the simple act of being tended to gave dignity to suffering. The notebook in which he wrote names, the cane with which he pointed, the herbs that perfumed the room, all symbolized that someone still cared enough to stand beside the dying. Reactions varied by class. Wealthier households often had private physicians and viewed plague doctors with suspicion. City-appointed doctors were sometimes outsiders, less experienced, or bound by contract to treat the poor rather than the elite. For merchants and nobles, the bird-masked figure might seem like a sign of disorder, a reminder of the suffering of the masses rather than a personal protector. By contrast, poorer citizens, who had no other access to medical care, often relied on plague doctors. Their treatments might not save lives, but their records preserved names, their advice offered comfort, and their presence gave structure to chaos. Children, in particular, were fascinated and terrified. The sight of a towering figure with glassy eyes and a curved beak was unforgettable. Some chroniclers described children hiding when a plague doctor passed, while others note that they followed at a distance, whispering tales about the Birdman who came to carry away the sick. Over time, this image became part of folklore, blending fear with curiosity. In villages, the memory of plague doctors lingered long after the epidemics ended, retold in stories that painted them as ghostly visitors. Not all reactions were respectful. Satirical poems, plays, and engravings often mocked plague doctors. Writers lampooned their bird-like masks, suggesting that they looked more like entertainers than physicians. Some accused them of greed, pointing out that many were paid by the city whether patients lived or died. Others joked that the herbs in their beaks were more pleasant to smell than their remedies were effective. In these critiques, we hear the frustration of people who felt abandoned by medicine, who coped with loss by laughing at the figures who symbolized its limits. Yet satire did not erase fear. Even in mockery, plague doctors were acknowledged as powerful symbols. Their strange costumes made them unforgettable. Their roles made them unavoidable. The songs that ridiculed them also spread their image. The jokes confirmed their place in public memory. In this way, ridicule and reverence coexisted, each reflecting different aspects of the human response to plague. Tension sometimes boiled into hostility. In certain towns, plague doctors were accused of spreading disease rather than curing it. Their constant presence among the sick made them suspicious figures. Rumors spread that they poisoned wells, that their canes carried infection, that their strange masks hid sinister intentions. In times of panic, mobs sometimes turned against them. Contracts reveal that cities often had to provide plague doctors with guards or lodging within secure quarters, a sign of how precarious their position could be. Despite such hostility, many citizens formed bonds with their plague doctors. Diaries and chronicles occasionally preserve touching stories of doctors who stayed by patients' sides when families fled, who comforted children, who risked themselves to write wills or deliver last words. These acts of humanity softened the eerie appearance of the mask. Behind the bird's face was still a man, weary but steadfast. For those who survived, memories of kindness often outweighed fears. The religious atmosphere of plague-stricken Europe also shaped public reaction. Some saw plague doctors as instruments of divine will, their masks a kind of priestly garb suited for a world under judgment. Others viewed them with suspicion, believing that only prayer and repentance could bring healing. This divide sometimes created conflict, physicians offering medical remedies in a society that often preferred spiritual explanations. Yet both roles, priest and doctor, were essential, each addressing different needs of body and soul. Art reinforced these perceptions. Woodcuts and engravings depicted plague doctors in their full costume, canes in hand, striding through ruined streets. These images circulated widely, fixing the bird mask in collective imagination. For viewers far from the centers of outbreak, the doctor became less a man and more a symbol of plague itself. His image embodied both fear and fascination, blending the grotesque with the heroic. In the long memory of Europe, the public reactions to plague doctors were layered. They were feared as omens, welcomed as servants, mocked as failures, and remembered as symbols. Each response reflected the needs of the moment. Fear sought scapegoats, grief sought comfort, humor sought release. The bird mask allowed all of these responses to converge. It was a canvas on which society painted its anxieties, its hopes, and its judgments. Even today, the image of the plague doctor endures not because of his medical success, but because of these public reactions. The costume survives in carnival masks, literature, and art precisely because it captured the imagination of those who saw it. The people of plague-stricken Europe did not forget the bird-headed figure, whether they feared, mocked, or respected him. In their whispers, songs, and stories, he lived on, and through them, he lives still in our cultural memory. The bird-like costume of the plague doctor has become one of the most enduring images of Europe's battle with pestilence. Yet beyond its strange appearance, the question lingers: did it actually work? Did the long waxed coat, the glass-eyed mask, and the beak stuffed with herbs truly protect those who wore them? Or was it little more than theater, a ritual of defense shaped by fear and flawed science? To answer, we must weigh both the effectiveness and the limitations of this haunting uniform, looking at how it functioned in practice and how it reflected the knowledge of its time. The logic behind the costume was rooted in the theory of miasma, the belief that plague spread through poisoned air. According to this model, breathing foul vapors corrupted the body's humors and brought disease. The beak, filled with herbs such as rosemary, juniper, and cloves, was designed as a filter. As air passed through the aromatic materials, it was thought to be cleansed and rendered safe. The waxed cloak and leather gloves added another layer of protection, preventing contagion from clinging to fabric or skin. In this framework, The costume was entirely reasonable. Modern science allows us to test these assumptions. We know today that plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread primarily by fleas carried on rats, and sometimes through respiratory droplets in pneumonic cases. Herbs in the beak did nothing to block bacteria. Aromatic vapors could not sterilize air. Glass lenses protected the eyes from dust, but not from microscopic infection. From this perspective, the costume failed in its central aim. It did not stop the true vectors of disease. Yet to dismiss the costume as entirely useless would be unfair. Some parts of the design, though based on flawed theory, offered accidental protection. The long, waxed coat and gloves reduced exposure to fleas, which could not easily cling to the smooth, oiled surface. Covering the entire body minimized direct contact with infected patients, contaminated bedding, or bodily fluids. The cane, used to examine from a distance, further reduced touch. These measures, though imperfect, likely lowered risk compared to doctors who wore ordinary clothes. The psychological effect was another form of effectiveness. For plague doctors, the costume created a sense of safety, however illusory. Facing death daily, they needed the armor of ritual. To put on the mask and robe was to prepare mentally for the grim task ahead. For patients, the costume signaled professionalism, preparation, and authority. Even if cures were rare, the sight of a masked doctor entering a house meant that society had not abandoned them. This reassurance mattered in a world where despair itself could spread like a contagion. Still, the limitations were stark. The beak restricted vision and muffled speech, making communication difficult. The glass eyepieces often fogged, further hampering sight. The herbs inside, while fragrant, grew damp and moldy, requiring constant replacement. Breathing through the beak was hot and suffocating, especially during long visits in summer heat. The waxed cloak was heavy, and combined with gloves and boots, made movement cumbersome. The costume, designed to protect, also exhausted its wearer. Another limitation was access. Not every city could afford to provide such elaborate uniforms for its plague doctors. Many physicians continued to work in simpler robes or improvised with vinegar-soaked cloths. The famous bird mask became iconic in Italy and France, but was less common elsewhere. Its image spread through engravings and satire, not necessarily through universal practice. Thus, the effectiveness of the costume was geographically limited, more symbol than standard. Even when used, the costume did not guarantee survival. Records show that many plague doctors perished despite their gear. Their deaths reveal the limits of protection when the true cause of disease was unknown. No layer of herbs or wax could prevent a flea bite. No cane could stop a cough in close quarters. The costume slowed risk, but could not erase it. In this sense, its effectiveness was partial, better than nothing, but far from adequate. The costume also carried social limitations. Its eerie appearance frightened many citizens. Some saw the bird mask as a herald of death, its approach a sign that hope was gone. Children hid, neighbors whispered, rumors spread that doctors themselves carried contagion. The very uniform that was meant to protect also isolated, turning the doctor into a figure apart from the community. Trust was fragile, and sometimes the mask deepened suspicion rather than easing it. From a broader perspective, the costume's limitations reflect the boundaries of knowledge in the early modern world. Without microscopes, without germ theory, physicians relied on what they could see, smell, and theorize. They observed that foul air accompanied disease, and so they built a costume to combat air. They noted that covering the body slowed illness, and so they created waxed coats. Their reasoning was logical within their framework, even if misguided by modern standards. The plague doctor's garb was thus a bridge between tradition and science, flawed, yet a step toward the idea of protective equipment. In the end, the costume was both effective and limited. It worked as psychological armor, as partial physical barrier, a civic symbol. It failed as a true defense against the bacterium that ravaged Europe. Its value lay less in prevention than in presence. It allowed doctors to enter plague houses with some confidence, to perform their duties, to bear witness when others fled. In that sense, its effectiveness cannot be measured only in survival rates. It must also be measured in resilience, in the persistence of human effort against despair. The bird mask endures in memory not because it saved lives, but because it embodied the attempt. It shows us how people confronted the unknown, with herbs, with wax, with ritual, with courage dressed in strange forms. Its limitations remind us of how far medicine had yet to travel. Its effectiveness reminds us that even in error, humans sought to protect, to serve, and to endure. The plague doctor, with his waxed cloak, his cane, and above all his bird-like mask, occupies a place in history far larger than his actual numbers or medical success. In life, he was often a temporary figure, hired by towns during epidemics and dismissed once the danger passed. Yet in memory, he became immortal. His legacy survives not in medical achievements, but in symbols, art, folklore, and the imagination of later generations. To trace this legacy is to understand how societies remember their fears and transform them into enduring images. During the 17th century, when the bird mask was most widely used in Italy and France, engravings and pamphlets fixed its image in public consciousness. Illustrations showed plague doctors striding through ruined streets, canes outstretched, masks looming over the sick. These prints circulated widely, spreading the costume's fame far beyond the cities where it was worn. Even in places where the bird mask had never been common, people came to associate it with pestilence. Thus, the legacy began not with the doctor's work, but with his representation. Satire played a role as well. Writers and cartoonists mocked the bird-like figure, exaggerating his beak, portraying him as foolish, greedy, or ineffectual. Plays turned him into a comic character, a grotesque presence meant to elicit nervous laughter. Yet even satire preserved the memory. To mock is also to remember, and in the jokes of 17th century Europe, the plague doctor lived on. His strangeness was too striking to fade, too symbolic to be forgotten. As plague receded in the 18th century, the doctor's costume shifted from practical gear to cultural relic. Outbreaks still occurred, but less frequently, and by the 19th century germ theory had begun to replace miasma theory. The bird mask lost its medical justification, but it gained new life in art and theater. In Venetian Carnival, masks resembling plague doctors became popular. Their grotesque beaks transformed from symbols of terror into costumes of play. What once haunted streets now danced in masquerades. This transformation from horror to theater reveals much about memory. Societies often turn their darkest symbols into objects of humor or art, a way to tame fear. The plague doctor's legacy followed this path. His costume, once a shield against death, became a mask worn for amusement. Yet beneath the laughter lingered echoes of the past. Even at Carnival, the long beak still whispered of pestilence, a reminder that history's shadows cannot be entirely erased. In literature, the plague doctor continued to appear. Romantic writers of the 19th century, fascinated by the Gothic and the macabre, revived his image as a symbol of mystery and dread. Painters used him to evoke the mood of decay and mortality. Later, in the 20th and 21st centuries, the bird mask found new life in popular culture, appearing in novels, films, video games, and even music. Its shape, instantly recognizable, carried associations of plague, death, and the eerie persistence of fear. Historians, too, have found in the plague doctor a useful lens. His costume illustrates the medical theories of his age, the limits of knowledge, and the human response to crisis. He reminds us that progress is not linear, that even flawed practices can pave the way for future insights. The waxed cloak, the gloves, the the mask, all represent early attempts at personal protective equipment, precursors in spirit, if not in function, to the protective gear of modern medicine. In this sense, the plague doctor's legacy is not only cultural but scientific, a step on the long road toward understanding contagion. Folklore preserved him as well. In rural tales, the bird-headed man became a figure of warning, sometimes a ghostly presence said to appear in fields at night, sometimes a messenger of doom. Parents told children stories of the plague doctor who carried away the sick, part cautionary tale, part echo of lived experience. These stories, passed down orally, ensured that even communities far from cities retained some memory of the strange figure who walked in times of pestilence. The legacy of the plague doctor also lies in his symbolism. He embodies the human attempt to make visible what is invisible. The plague was unseen, its causes unknown, its spread mysterious. The mask gave it a face, turned fear into a tangible figure. To see the bird-headed doctor was to see the embodiment of disease itself, but also of resistance to it. He was both omen and protector, both reminder of mortality and symbol of endurance. This duality, fear and hope, death and survival, ensured his survival and memory in the modern era. Especially during times of renewed disease, the plague doctor resurfaces. During epidemics such as influenza in 1918 or more recently global outbreaks, images of the bird mask reappear in newspapers, art, and online culture. People reach back to history, using the plague doctor as a shorthand for fear of contagion. He becomes a way to connect past and present, to remind ourselves that humanity has faced pestilence before and endured. Museums now display replicas of the costume, and visitors linger before the glass-eyed mask with a mixture of fascination and unease. Scholars debate its origins, artists reinterpret it, and audiences encounter it anew in exhibitions and performances. The plague doctor has transcended his historical moment. He is no longer merely a physician of the 17th century, but a cultural archetype, an icon of how humans dress fear and form. Thus, the legacy of the plague doctor is layered. He survives as medical history, as cultural memory, as symbol, as costume, as warning, as entertainment. His mask, once stuffed with herbs, now stuffed with meaning, speaks across centuries. It tells us of the fragility of knowledge, the resilience of ritual, and the persistence of fear. Above all, it tells us that the human imagination never forgets its darkest encounters. When we picture the plague doctor today, we do not think of his notebooks or his contracts, his fees or his failures. We think of the mask, the long beak, the glassy eyes, the figure that is both bird and man. In that mask lives his true legacy, the power of an image to outlast reality, to transform history into symbol, and to remind us, always, of the strange ways people have faced death with courage clothed in fear. The image of the plague doctor, with his long waxed coat, wide-brimmed hat, cane, and bird-like mask, has outlived the very epidemics he was hired to face. His treatments were rarely effective. His theories were bound by the limits of his age, and yet he became unforgettable. In the quiet rhythm of his daily work, walking through empty streets, recording names of the dead, offering herbs and small remedies, he embodied the human effort to bring order to chaos for the people of plague-stricken Europe. His appearance was both terrifying and comforting. He was a reminder that disease was near, but also that someone remained to face it. His mask, stuffed with herbs, did not stop the plague, yet it symbolized hope in action. His cane kept distance, his waxed cloak gave protection, and his very presence told the sick and the dying that they had not been abandoned. The legacy of the plague doctor is not measured in cures, but in memory. He survives in art, in theater, in folklore, and in the imagination of every generation that has since wondered at his strange, bird-like face. He is both a historical reality and a cultural symbol of fear, of resilience, and of the endless search for protection against the unseen that as you drift into rest tonight. Think of that quiet figure walking through hushed medieval streets, his cane tapping on the stones, his mask glowing faintly in the lamplight. A strange guardian in dark times. He reminds us of humanity's will to endure, even when knowledge fails and fear surrounds. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this calm journey into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you can return again for more gentle stories of history. Good night.